and they got back to Ireland and ruled in peace. Well, ruled in a distinct lack of peace and harmony, actually, because they were very traumatized. How are ye? Welcome back to the Candlelittales YouTube channel and another explainer video. Today we are going to talk about the Irish gods, who they are, what we know about them, what we don't know about them, which, as usual with Irish mythology, is a slightly bigger pile than what we do know about them. And, just give you a little bit of a rundown on what the crack is with the gods of the Celts. Before we get into the Irish gods, let's talk about Irish mythology and how it has been passed down to us and how we have what we have of it. The Greeks and the Romans had a writing system, and they wrote down the stories of their gods. The people who worshipped the gods wrote about the gods. You see, like in Homer's Odyssey, this is a person who believes in those gods, writing about those gods and how they interacted with humans and how he saw that interaction going. Things were different in Ireland. Things were often different in Ireland. One of the wrinkles to the whole thing is that Irish people did develop a writing system. It's called Ogham, and it's very beautiful. You might see it. It's lines with little notches on them. But we didn't use Ogham to write texts. We did not write books in Ogham. Ogham was used for boundary markers and gravestones and not much else. It was not used for writing books. So the stories of Irish gods and Irish heroes were not necessarily recorded by people who were practitioners of that particular faith. In fact, most of the stories that were written down by Christian monks. And there is a bit of variation in the different texts. There's quite a lot of variation in them, actually. Obviously, some of those monks were similar to modern folklorists. They were interested in preserving the tradition of the place that they were in. They were interested in writing down those stories pretty faithfully. Some others were really not interested in that and were interested in forging links and kind of connecting Ireland with biblical history and pseudo-history and trying to smooth out the timelines and make everything kind of fit in together. So there's a bit of variation in how things were written down and how things were recorded. Irish manuscripts are also the oldest vernacular manuscripts in the world. There were certainly in Europe. They were written down, this was Latin script, but they were recording the Irish language. They were writing down the vernacular. So there's an interesting little wrinkle there in terms of what was preserved and who it was preserved by. Because of course, the other side of that was that the pagans in Ireland, or those who believed in things other than Christianity, they also didn't write anything down. And like I said, not for want of a writing system. They had a writing system, but it seems to have been an article of faith that you didn't write down certain things, that the most important things shouldn't be written down. This was Druidic traditions and Druidic practices were esoteric, which means that they were closed practices. You were not supposed to speak of them to people who were not part of the same tradition. So they weren't going around publishing pamphlets and trying to get converts in. They were keeping these traditions quite close to the vest. So people were not allowed to witness it. People were not allowed to come in and record it. And so you get some pretty wild speculation from, Roman historians and from Christian historians or from Christian scholars writing down things that the Celts were up to, but we really don't have a huge amount of reliable information as to what they were getting up to and how they were observing their religions. And there's a kind of a saying that I can't remember where I got it from now, that writing things down was considered to be the first step to forgetting, which I think is a real validation of sort of oral storytelling and recording things in folk memory. And it was something that I used to think was a very, very sad thing, that they didn't write down a Druidic, volume of how things were practiced and how people related to the gods. And I don't think it's that sad anymore, because I think, it would be another religious text for people to fight about, and people fight so much about the religious texts that we do have. So it's probably no bad thing that they decided not to write anything down. I'm not going to argue with them anymore anyway. A lot was lost, and there's no denying that. And there's a lot that today we kind of have to imaginatively fill in, and you see a lot of people doing a lot of imagining about Celtic gods and Irish gods and what they were about, and I always advise a little bit of caution as to where they're getting this from, because sometimes people very much will like work with a deity or a god and then will make some pretty strong claims about their version of that god being the definitive version, and I think you just kind of want to watch out for some of that stuff. So who were they? Who were these gods? Well, the gods of the Celts were called the Tuatha De, or the Tuatha De Danann. The Tuatha De means the god people, the godlike people. And the Tuatha De Danann is a potentially later interpretation of that, which calls them the people of the goddess, and the goddess is usually named as Danu or Anu. It's possible that Danu didn't exist at all ever, and that the De Danann was a way of differentiating the pagan gods from the Christian gods, and that kind of came in around the time that Christianity came in, but it's hard to say. Hard to say anything definitive about a lot of this stuff, to be honest. And these were godlike beings. They were shining ones. They were tall. They were beautiful. They were magical. They had incredible powers. They were shapeshifters. They were shapers of the landscape. They were kings and they were queens and they were warriors and they were lovers. And there's stories about the Tuatha De Danann. There's stories about them doing almost everything that you would expect, having battles and falling in love and all kinds of different conflicts and reconciliations. The one thing that they didn't do, and that we have no story about, is we have no creation myth in Irish mythology. There's no story of the Tuatha De Danann creating either humans or the land, which is interesting, because it's not like there's a suggestion that there was a myth and then we didn't write it down. It seems more like this is a completely different orientation towards humanity and gods and godlike people. And the orientation in Irish myth is that the land was there first. And there's this kind of primacy of land over inhabitants. That's, I think, kind of fascinating. Because we don't have a creation myth. We do have a pseudo-history of Ireland that's kind of instead of a creation myth. And that's called the Book of Invasions, or the Laura Goala Éireann. The oldest surviving mythologies that we have about Ireland. So I'm going to attempt to give a rundown. We have told the stories on the podcast a few times, and I'll link some of the episodes below if people want to have another little listen and refresh of them in a less informative and more poetical kind of a way, but in relatively brief. I'm going to keep an eye on the time and see how brief. Famous last words. There is dispute over the first person. In some versions, the first people to set foot on Ireland were two Spanish fishermen who took refuge there and then were never able to find the island again, and it kind of disappeared into the mist. And then the other potential person is a woman named Kesser, who was said to have come from Northern Africa, leading a group of 3 times 50 women and only 3 men. And her group did not survive, which is a recurring theme in the Book of Invasions. It's a bit of a weird text. There's a lot of people who come and do a lot of stuff and then die out completely. But Kesser is kind of the controversial first person to arrive, because Kesser's story is very much tied in with the story of the biblical flood. In fact, that's one of the reasons given as to why her people didn't survive, that the flood found them, that they were attempting to outrace the flood and find a place without sin, an uninhabited island that they could take refuge in. But one way or another, they were wiped out. That's also a little strange, because the next group of people to arrive, who were either the second or the first or the third, depending on how you're counting, you see how confusing this gets very quickly. The next group were led by a giant called Partholon. Partholon came from Greece, and Partholon and his people were also fleeing something. They were fleeing a curse, because Partholon was a kin killer. He'd killed his parents and I think his brothers in order to gain power. And because of that, there was a curse on him, that all of his affairs would come to nothing, and that everything he attempted would end in defeat and destruction. The Partholon story mostly centres around bringing the first cattle to Ireland, bringing the first guest houses to Ireland, and also the first court case in Ireland, which was a case that he took No, it was a case that his wife, Delgnit, took against him because he killed her lover and her dog. He said that he had a right to because she had cheated on him, and she said her counter argument was a poem, and basically boiled down to, if you didn't want me to sleep with handsome men, you shouldn't have left me alone with a handsome man. And she won, which is hilarious. But Partholon's story does not end hilariously. Partholon's story ends with a plague wiping everyone out. Now, in most versions of the Book of Invasions, there's a survivor. There's either the survivor of Kesser's people is called Fintan, or there's a survivor of Partholon's people, whose name I can't remember, because we always tell the Fintan story, because Fintan is also a cool shapeshifter who turns into a bunch of different animals, and so he's a bit more interesting. But either way, there's sort of a witness figure to the rest of the Irish invasions, because you'll notice we have not gotten to the Tuatha De Danann yet. And really, Kesser's the only one of those that's kind of controversial as being a biblical tie-in. And we're still not getting onto the Tuatha De Danann, because the next person to arrive was a person called Nemed. Nemed's arrival in Ireland was the sort of most successful to date, we'll say. Not that they weren't wiped out, just that they weren't wiped out straight away. So Nemed had quite a successful time in Ireland, and one of the big things that Nemed did was Nemed had a war against these people, the Fomorians. Now, whether the Fomorians are sort of magically descended from Kesser's people, I don't know, or whether they are people of the sea and raiders from the north, I don't know. It's not clear. It's never made clear. Much of Irish mythology is not clarified. So either way, there are these figures, the Fomorians from Tory Island is sort of their base and their home. And they were said to have a special relationship with the sea and a special power over the sea, and to maybe even live under the sea. And they fought, they raided Nemed, and they also raided Partholon. Partholon had to deal with them. But Nemed had a particular cruelty to him. He had a nasty streak. And although he defeated the Fomorians, he also decided that he wanted to wipe them out. So he followed them back to Tory Island. He gathered a fleet and he sailed against them with the intent to eradicate them. And the Fomorians called on their powers, called on the sea, and scattered his fleet. And we're still not on the Tuatha De Danann, but we are getting closer, because the different ships of Nemed's followers went to different places. One went to Britain, and it said that Nemed's grandson, Britain Whale, was their chieftain, and that's why Great Britain is called Britain, and that's very funny to me as an Irish person. Another ship went south, and these were people who were put under terrible oppression. They were enslaved in Greece. They were made to do hard labour, and they eventually escaped, having sustained themselves on stories of this sort of promised land, this mythic homeland that they could return to, which was, of course, Ireland. And they got back to Ireland, divided Ireland into the mythical 5 provinces, there are 4 today, and ruled in peace. Well, ruled in a distinct lack of peace and harmony, actually, because they were very traumatised for 37 years. And then, at last, the Tuatha De Danann showed up. They were the survivors of another of Nemed's ships, and they were the people who went north. They went north, and the story is that they went to these 4 magical islands, and they learned magic, and they acquired all of these magical items, and they acquired all of this wisdom, and they acquired all of this just kind of superhuman coolness. And then they came back, and they were really hot, and they were really beautiful, and they were really skillful, and they were really magical, and they met the Firbolg. There's a great story about the champion of the Firbolg and the champion of the Tuatha De Danann meeting and realising midway through their conversation that they were speaking the same language, and comparing histories and realising that they were both descended from Nemed and therefore at root the same people, and both of them going back to their leaders and their leaders being like, nah, fuck that, we're going to fight. So unfortunately for the Firbolg, the Tuatha De Danann and the Firbolg had a fight, first battle of Moytura, and the Firbolg lost. But they were allowed to stay. They were given the province of Connacht by the Dagda, who's one of the gods. We'll get to him. We'll get to the different ones in a second. And then the next invasion that happened were the Sons of Mill. Many years later, the Sons of Mill, who were also known as the Celts, came to Ireland and fought the Tuatha De Danann, which is an interesting introduction between a people and their gods, was that they fought them. The Tuatha De Danann did not depart. They moved into the other world. And that concept of the other world is just such a cornerstone of Irish myth and folklore. This idea that there is a world beside the world, that there is a world that is parallel to the world, and that is where the spirits of the dead go, and that is where the gods dwell, and it is a place of magic and mystery, and you can find yourself in it inadvertently if you are incautious, and you can find it coming after you if you are disrespectful, and it's always kind of right there next to you, eavesdropping frequently, which is why you have to be polite when you're talking about the other world. So an interesting introduction between a people and their gods, and also an interesting idea as to like the Celts who defeated the Tuatha De Danann in battle were also the people who regarded them as gods. So you don't have any story of the Tuatha De Danann creating the Celtic people. You don't have any story of them. You don't really have many stories of them taking care of them either. What you do have is a storytelling tradition about these older heroes. And a lot of them are quite strong characters, we'll say. And a lot of them are very tied to landscape, which, like I said, is very foundational in Irish mythology. The Din Seanachas, the lore of places, is really important. This idea that every place name in Ireland has a story behind it, has a link to history, to mythology, to the other world. So there are gods and goddesses who leave their name kind of on the landscape, like the province of Louth is named after Lugh. The Boyne River is named after the goddess Boann. The Shannon River is named after the goddess Shannon, which is the longest river in Ireland. Interestingly enough, the origin stories of the Boyne and the Shannon are almost identical, except they have different names. They both involve a goddess looking into a well of knowledge, which is forbidden to be looked into, and the well flooding and running after the goddess, and she becomes a river, or she is drowned by the river and the river remains. There's also, of course, the Morrigan, the battle crow, one of the most hands-on of the goddesses. She really sticks around and stays with the Celts and sort of whispers in dreams and stirs up trouble and stirs up war, and she's a very important figure in the Táin Bó Cúailnge, the cattle raid of Cooley. Unusually present and very much involved in stirring up trouble. Also a goddess of triple aspect. She can be a crow, she can be a crone, she can be a beautiful woman. We have many stories of the Morrigan. Bridget is another one of the goddesses who performed the first keening in Ireland when she saw her son slain in a battle. We have also stories of her, and she is of course the namesake of Saint Bridget, who became one of Ireland's patron saints and who has a whole day about her that we also did an explainer video about. And then there's the Cailleach, the shaper of landscape, the winter goddess. She's the crone, she's the hag. She's said to have created the cairns at Lough Crew. She's said to be associated with the Beara Peninsula. And then you have Lugh Fada, I mentioned him already, giving his name to the county of Louth, and sometimes associated with the sun, although that's probably just a mistake in the etymology of his name. He is also called the Savildonach, the master of all skills, and there's some great stories about him and the second battle of Moytura, taking on his monstrous grandfather Balor of the Evil Eye. There was Gobnu, the smith, who was a great craftsman, able to make wonderful, powerful, magical weapons for the Tuatha De Danann, and Dian Cecht, who was an incredible healer and was able to make these healing wells and fill them up with herbs and cure people by bathing them in this healing well. He also had children, Miach and Aramids, and there's a whole story about him and his son, and it all went very, very bad for Dian Cecht, and even worse for Miach, because he sort of was instrumental in putting a lot of the healing herbs in the world out into the world. And then the Dagda, sometimes called the Good God, because he was good at everything, especially hospitality and lovemaking. He had a cauldron of plenty, and he had a mighty club that could kill with one end and bring you back to life with the other end, and took 10 men to lift it, if not the Dagda. And also a fantastic musician, strongly associated with the harp, which is of course such a potent symbol of Ireland. And there's Manannán Mac Lir, another one who's very involved in mortal lives, unusually for the Tuatha De Danann, but possibly not part of those people, possibly a sort of an older figure. He's associated with the sea. Lir is an old word for the ocean and the sea, and associated with the Isle of Man, which is named after him, which is an island between Ireland and Great Britain. So he's also possibly the one who created the other worlds by waving his magical cloak, because he had a magical cloak that he could shake between people, and if it was shaken between them, it would ensure that they would never meet again. And so there's some stories that say that he's the one who created the other world, because at the Battle of Taltu, rather than fight, Manannán shook his cloak between the two armies, and the Sons of Mill on one side and the Tuatha De Danann on the other side, and it was such a separation that the other world was created, and they disappeared from view, but did not leave, and are still sort of here. Now, of course, most Irish people today are not worshipping the Irish gods and the Celtic gods. That worship tradition did not survive, I think, in a very real sense. A lot of it was eradicated quite successfully with the rise of Christianity. But with Christianity, the beliefs did not entirely go away, but they changed. And what had been probably worship traditions became folk traditions and became folklore. The gods shifted, the gods transformed, they became diminished, both in importance and in physical stature, and they shifted into the fairies or the fae or the fairy folk or the good neighbours. And that's a topic for another time, I think. So let us know. What Irish gods have you heard of before? Have you heard of any of the ones I mentioned? Are there other ones that you've heard of that I didn't mention? Which ones would you like us to do an explainer video about? What would you like to know more about? And what other aspects of Irish folklore and mythology would you like us to talk about? And thank you very much for listening. And you can do all of the things to engage with this video and bring it to more people. You!